The colder the night, the fewer people came down the logging road, and Sergeant Reeve Callum had built his entire life around that fact. The road itself was barely more than a scar through the pines. 2 ruts of frozen mud that the county had stopped maintaining years ago, somewhere around the time Reeve stopped answering phone calls. His cabin sat 3 miles back from the highway, tucked into a fold of the Cascades, where the Douglas firs grew so thick that by October the place was dark by 4 in the afternoon. He'd bought it with cash, told no one the address. The nearest neighbor was a retired teacher named something or other who lived 8 miles west and had the good sense to mind her own business. It was the first week of November when the storm came down from British Columbia and erased the sky. Reeve stood on the porch watching it build over the ridgeline, that particular shade of gray that old loggers called a widowmaker sky, and felt nothing except the satisfaction of knowing nobody was coming up that road tonight, maybe not for a week. He pressed his knuckles against the porch rail, feeling the cold settle into the joints, and looked down at the dog sitting beside him. Kodiak was a Belgian Malinois, 82 pounds of scar tissue and muscle memory. He'd been assigned to Reeve in Kandahar 11 years ago, back when Reeve was still a SEAL and still believed that most problems could be solved by moving fast and hitting hard. They'd done 3 deployments together. Kodiak had taken a piece of shrapnel above his left ear on their last one, left a bare patch of skin the size of a silver dollar that never grew back. Reeve had a matching scar along his left forearm. The vet back at Pendleton had said they were lucky. Reeve had smiled and said nothing, because the men who hadn't come home weren't available to weigh in on the concept of luck. He'd mustered out 8 months later, filled out the paperwork for Kodiak's retirement transfer, and signed his own name at the bottom as the adopting handler, which was either the easiest decision he'd ever made or the only one that made any sense at all, depending on how you thought about it. That was 4 years ago. Now Kodiak pressed his shoulder against Reeve's calf and watched the storm with the same flat, professional attention he applied to everything. The dog didn't do comfort, exactly, but he did proximity, and Reeve had learned that was enough. "Come on," Reeve said. They went inside. The cabin was small and deliberate. A wood stove, a cot, a table with 2 chairs that Reeve used only one of. He'd built the bookshelves himself from lumber he'd milled by hand, and they ran floor to ceiling on the north wall, packed with field manuals, histories of forgotten wars, a few novels he'd read so many times the spines had gone soft. There was no television, no internet except a satellite connection he kept for emergencies and accessed maybe 3 times a year. He had a generator for when the power went out, which was often, and a hand pump on the kitchen sink that pulled from a well he'd dug himself. He was not, he told himself, hiding. He was simply finished. Reeve built the fire higher and sat in the chair nearest the wood stove with a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside him. Kodiak lay across the threshold between the kitchen and the living area, chin on his paws, watching the door the way he always watched the door. Not anxious, just attentive, ready. The wind picked up outside and the cabin groaned the way old wood groaned, settling into itself, and Reeve closed his eyes and tried to remember what silence used to feel like before it started sounding like static. He didn't sleep. He hadn't slept properly in going on 3 years. By morning, the storm had dropped 14 inches, and the temperature was sitting at 12 degrees. Reeve pulled on his thermals, his fleece, his outer shell, and his boots, and he and Kodiak went out to split wood. It was the kind of work that required enough attention to keep your mind busy, and not enough to make you feel like you were accomplishing something, which suited Reeve perfectly. He worked for 2 hours. The cold was absolute and clean. Kodiak patrolled the perimeter of the clearing in wide, lazy arcs, nose down, cataloguing whatever the storm had deposited overnight. It was on the 3rd arc that the dog stopped. Reeve set them all down. Kodiak had his nose pointing toward the eastern tree line, ears forward, weight distributed. Not alarmed, but interested in a way that made the hair on Reeve's arms stand up, despite the fleece and the shell and the cold. The dog made no sound. He didn't need to. In 11 years, Reeve had learned to read Kodiak the way some men read weather, and what he was reading right now was, something is there that wasn't there before. "Hold," Reeve said quietly. He went inside and came back with the binoculars. It took him 40 seconds to find it in the trees, a shape that was wrong for the landscape, too angular, too still. He adjusted the focus and the shape resolved itself into a vehicle. A dark green Forest Service truck, driver's side door hanging open, partially obscured by a pine that had come down in the night. From this distance he couldn't tell if anyone was in it. He could tell, from the angle of the front end, that it had gone off the road and hit the tree hard. Reeve stood very still for a long moment, calculating. Then he said, "Heel," and started walking. The truck had been there since, before the worst of the storm. There was snow packed into the wheel wells and drifted against the underside of the chassis. The driver's window was cracked 2 inches. The engine was off. Reeve came around the open door with his hand near his side and looked in. A woman was slumped against the steering wheel. She was young, late 20s, maybe 30, and wearing a Forest Service uniform with a fleece vest over it that was nowhere near adequate for 14 inches of overnight snow. Her hands were bare. Her lips were the color of old pewter. On the passenger seat beside her sat a backpack, a clipboard with some kind of survey form on it, and a radio that had slid off the seat and lay on the floorboard with its antenna bent. Reeve pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. Her pulse was there. Slow, too slow. "Hey." He put his hand on her shoulder. She didn't respond. He said it louder, closer to her ear. "Hey, wake up." Nothing. He stepped back and looked at the situation with the same flat inventory he'd applied to worse ones. Female, early 30s, unconscious, hypothermic, no obvious external injuries, remote location, no functioning radio, 14-inch snowpack between here and the highway. He had a truck, he had chains. He had a first aid kit that would handle most things, but not this. He pulled out his phone. 1 bar, barely. He got the county dispatch on the second try and told them what he had. The dispatcher told him the road crew was working the highway, and it would be 3 hours minimum before they could get a plow up to him. "She won't last 3 hours, Reeve said. "Sir, I'm sorry He hung up. He looked at Kodiak, who looked back at him with the same expression he always had, which was a kind of patient, undemanding presence, like a compass needle that just points and doesn't ask questions. "Okay," Reeve said. He got the woman out of the truck. She weighed less than he expected, and more than he could comfortably carry over uneven ground in snow. So he got her over his shoulder in a modified fireman's carry and started back through the trees toward the cabin, watching his footing, letting Kodiak lead. The dog moved ahead of him, picking the route with the same instinct he'd used in Kandahar's narrow streets. Not the fastest path, but the surest one. Reeve's breathing went ragged by the 100-yard mark. His bad knee, the one that had ended his career before the paperwork did, sent signals up his thigh that he catalogued and set aside. He got her inside. He got her onto the cot, stripped her wet jacket and fleece vest, pulled 3 wool blankets from the chest at the foot of the bed, and checked her pulse again. Still there, still slow. He heated water on the wood stove, not boiling, just warm, and pressed a cloth to the back of her neck and her wrists. He built the fire up until the cabin was uncomfortably hot by any normal standard, and sat in his chair and watched her breathe and tried not to do anything that could be classified as praying. Kodiak lay across the base of the cot. He hadn't been told to, he'd just done it. 2 hours passed. The woman's color came back in increments, gray to ash to something closer to actual human skin. Her breathing deepened. At some point around mid-morning she moved her hand, and Reeve sat up straighter in his chair, and then she opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling with the unfocused expression of someone performing a systems check. Then she turned her head and saw Kodiak's face 6 inches from hers. She made a sound. Kodiak raised his head and regarded her with professional neutrality. "He won't hurt you," Reeve said from the chair. She turned toward his voice. Her eyes took a moment to locate him. She had dark hair, matted from the cold and the blankets, and eyes that were somewhere between brown and green, depending on the light. There was a cut above her right eyebrow. She'd hit the steering wheel that had scabbed over during the night. "Where?" Her voice came out, cracked and barely audible. "My cabin, about a quarter-mile from where you went off the road." He paused. "You had hypothermia. Still might. Don't try to sit up." She processed this, then, slowly and carefully. The truck is not your problem right now." She seemed to consider arguing this and then thought better of it. Her hand moved, found Kodiak's head rested there without seeming to realize she'd done it. The dog didn't move. He allowed it with the particular stillness of a creature that has learned the difference between a threat and someone who simply needs something to hold on to. Her name, he found out over the next hour as she came fully back to herself, was Sable Whitmore. She was a wildlife biologist with the Forest Service. The survey form on her passenger seat was for a wolverine monitoring project she'd been running solo for the past 3 seasons. She'd come up the logging road in the storm because she'd gotten a GPS ping from a tagged female who'd denned about a mile past Reeve's property line, and she'd wanted to verify the den before the snow got worse. "That was a bad call," Reeve said. "Yeah," she said. She didn't sound defensive about it, just tired in the way people sounded when they already knew something and didn't need it repeated. "I know." She was sitting up by then, the blankets around her shoulders, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that Reeve had made more out of reflex than hospitality. He was sitting in his chair at the table, which was far enough from the cot that it maintained a clear corridor of space between them. Kodiak had relocated to his usual post at the door. "Is there someone I should call?" Reeve asked. She shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. "My supervisor. She'll have noticed the truck by now if they've got the road open." "Road's not open." Storm took out a section of culvert down near the highway. "Could be another day, maybe 2. Sable looked at him for a moment. Then she looked around the cabin, the bookshelves, the wood stove, the one chair at the table that had clearly been occupied before she woke up in the other one. "Okay," she said quietly. Reeve called her supervisor on the satellite connection. He gave his name, his location, and a status report that was factual and brief. The supervisor, a woman named Gaza who sounded more relieved than professionally appropriate, said she'd have a crew up the road as soon as it was passable and asked if Sable was all right. Reeve said, "She's functional," and handed Sable the phone. He went outside to give her privacy. Kodiak followed him. They stood on the porch in the cold, and Reeve looked out at the cleared sky. The storm had broken, the way Pacific Northwest storms sometimes did, suddenly and completely, as if they'd said what they had to say. The pines were heavy with snow. The light was the particular winter white that bounced off every surface and made your eyes work too hard. He didn't know why he was bothered. He told himself it was the disruption, the presence of someone in a space that had been designed very deliberately, around the absence of presence. It had nothing to do with anything else. He was bothered because his routine had been disrupted, and he'd built his routine the way you built a retaining wall, not decorative, structural, essential, because without it the whole hillside moved. Kodiak pressed against his leg. Reeve reached down and rested his hand on the dog's neck without thinking about it. Inside, he could hear Sable's voice, low, even, professional. She was describing the location of the den site and the GPS coordinates of the last ping, and she was doing it calmly, which struck him as either impressive or foolish, given that she'd been grey-lipped and unconscious 2 hours ago. Probably impressive, possibly both. He stayed on the porch until she finished. The 2 days that followed had a shape that Reeve had not planned and could not entirely account for. Sable was not an intrusive person. She didn't fill silence with words the way some people did, as if quiet were a problem requiring a solution. She asked for what she needed: a spare toothbrush, a charger for her field radio, directions to the outhouse, and otherwise occupied herself with her survey notes, working at the far end of the table while Reeve worked at his end, which was reading and not speaking, and somehow this arrangement was not as terrible as it should have been. She did not ask him why he lived alone 3 miles up a logging road. He noticed this. On the second afternoon, she asked if Kodiak could go out with her to the tree line, because she'd spotted tracks that might be from the tagged wolverine, and she wanted a second opinion. Reeve started to say no. His reflex was always no, had been no for years, and then he looked at the dog, who was already at the door tail, making one slow arc. "He doesn't take orders from you," Reeve said. "I know." She looked at Kodiak. "I just thought he'd like to get out." Reeve looked at the dog. The dog looked at the door. Reeve put on his coat and went with them. They walked the tree line for 40 minutes. Sable moved the way. Field biologists moved, quietly and with attention, reading the ground the way Reeve read everything, looking for things that were out of place. She was right about the tracks. The stride pattern and the characteristic loping gait were unmistakable even to Reeve, who didn't know wolverines from any other animal. She crouched over the prints and made a note in her field book without making a production of it. "She came through after the storm," Sable said, checking her range, making sure everything was still where she left it. She said it like she was reporting a fact, not drawing a parallel, and maybe she wasn't. Probably she wasn't. Reeve kept his face neutral and said nothing. That night she cooked dinner, because she'd found his supply of dried beans and rice and a can of chipotles, and informed him without asking that she was making something with them. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her navigate his space. The unfamiliar shelves, the cast iron pan that required more wrist than people expected, with the easy competence of someone used to improvising in field conditions. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know." She didn't look up from the pan. "But you've got 3 days of my company, whether you like it or not, and I don't know how to be useless." Reeve didn't say anything. They ate at the table without talking much, which was fine. Kodiak sat beside the wood stove and watched the meal progress with the dignity of a creature who had long since made peace with the fact that some things were not for him. After dinner, she asked him how he'd ended up here. He told her the short version: SEAL teams, 12 years, medical separation, the cabin. He delivered it the way he delivered all such information, factual, forward-moving, revealing nothing that wasn't already visible from the outside. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Was it combat? The medical separation?" "Knee IED." A pause. "Mostly the knee." She nodded like she understood that mostly was doing significant work in that sentence, and had the grace not to push on it. "What about the dog?" she asked. "He was my assigned partner. I adopted him out when I mustered. He's very calm. He's very trained." Reeve looked at Kodiak. "There's a difference, is there?" Reeve thought about that longer than he expected to. "Less than you'd think," he said finally. She smiled at that. Not a performance of a smile, just something that happened on her face briefly and then was gone. He noted it the way he noted things, filed it away somewhere. 3 nights in, he woke at 0200 the way he always woke at 0200, with his heart in his throat and the particular wired-awake alertness of someone who'd spent too many years sleeping with his boots on. He lay in his sleeping bag. He'd taken the floor, given her the cot, made no discussion of it, and listened to the cabin breathe. Kodiak was at the door, alert posture, ears up. Reeve was on his feet before he finished processing why. He went to the window and looked out at the tree line and saw what Kodiak was watching. A shape, large, moving at the edge of the clearing in that particular, deliberate way that meant something with weight was not in a hurry. The moon was up. He could see the animal clearly enough. A black bear, female from the size, moving along the far tree line with a purpose that suggested she had somewhere to be. He exhaled. He looked at Kodiak. Kodiak looked at him with an expression that meant identified, not a threat, continuing to monitor. "Good," Reeve said quietly. He didn't go back to sleep. He sat in his chair and looked at the fire and thought about Wyatt. He always thought about Wyatt at Aero 200. Wyatt Sagan had been his teammate for 4 years. The specific, dense kind of friendship that happened when two people spent enough time in enough terrible places together that normal social architecture stopped applying. Wyatt had been from a small town in Georgia and had talked about his family the way some people talked about religion, which was to say constantly and with absolute conviction that it was the organizing principle of everything. He'd had a wife named something Reeve couldn't let himself think about too clearly, and a sister who sent cookies that arrived crushed but were eaten anyway, and plans, so many plans, the kind of plans that required a future, which Reeve had never been able to understand from the inside. The IED that took Reeve's knee had taken Wyatt's life. They'd been 6 feet apart. Reeve had not attended the funeral. He'd been in a hospital in Germany at the time, technically, which was true, and also not the reason he hadn't attended. The reason was that he'd known, looking at Wyatt's wife's face when she came to visit him at Pendleton 3 weeks after redeployment, that anything he said would be inadequate in a way that felt like further damage. He'd shaken her hand. He'd said he was sorry. He'd driven back to the base and never called. He'd heard she'd eventually moved somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. Washington, maybe Oregon. He hadn't let himself find out more specifically because finding out more specifically would have implied an intention he wasn't prepared to have. Reeve sat with all of this in the dark, the way he sat with it every night. And eventually the fire burned lower and the cabin cooled slightly, and somewhere in the trees the bear moved on. He was still sitting there when Sable got up. She came out of the sleeping area in her wool socks and the oversized flannel shirt she'd appropriated from his supply chest, her hair loose and disheveled, and she took one look at him and went directly to the wood stove without saying anything. She added 2 pieces of wood, then she put the kettle on. Then she sat in the other chair and looked at the fire. Reeve watched her do all of this. "You don't have to stay up," he said. "I wasn't asleep." She pulled her knees up to her chest. "What were you looking at earlier?" "I heard you get up. Bear working the east tree line." She watched the kettle. "Same one I've been seeing signs of all season. She's got a cub somewhere north of here, probably checking her range after the storm. A beat, like the wolverine." Reeve said nothing. "How long has it been?" Sable asked. He looked at her. "Since you've been up here alone," she said. "I'm not asking why. I'm just asking how long," he counted. 4 years. She nodded slowly, like she was doing arithmetic of her own. Then the kettle started, and she got up and made 2 cups of tea. He didn't drink tea, or hadn't, but he found himself holding the cup without objecting, and came back to her chair, and they sat together in a silence that was different from the silence earlier. He noticed that too. "My husband was a Marine," she said after a while. He looked at her. "Was," she said simply. He didn't ask. He'd learned, in the years that had the particular weight of those years, that there were sentences that were complete in themselves and didn't need a question appended to them. "Patrick," she said. "He died 3 years ago. Training accident. Fort Lewis." She said it in the flat, practiced way that meant she'd had to say it many times and had reduced it to its essential facts as a survival mechanism. "We'd been married for 4 years, no kids." She looked at the fire. "I came out here because he'd always wanted me to spend a season doing field work in the Cascades, and I kept saying we'd do it later when things quieted down, later when I had more time." A pause. "So I came." Reeve held the cup of tea. "I'm sorry," he said. It came out different than it usually did when he said it. Usually it was a transaction, a form, something to discharge social obligation and move on. This time it came out like it meant what it was supposed to mean, which alarmed him slightly. She glanced at him. "I know," she said. "I can tell." They stayed up until the sky began to lighten in the east, talking in the intermittent, low-key way that was less like conversation and more like thinking out loud in the presence of someone who wasn't going to hold it against you. She talked about Patrick sometimes, and Reeve talked about nothing directly, but somehow talked around the shape of Wyatt obliquely, which he'd never done with anyone. Kodiak lay between their chairs. At some point, his head ended up resting on Reeve's boot, and Reeve didn't move his foot. The road crew got through the next afternoon. There were 2 of them in a county plow, cheerful and loud in the particular way of people who worked outside, and were accustomed to being other people's rescue. Sable packed her backpack and her field equipment and her survey notes. She thanked Reeve in the practical, direct way she seemed to do everything, looking at him when she said it. Not away. He walked her to the door. "The Wolverine Den," she said. "It's about a mile northeast. Possible there are 2 females. I'm seeing spaced tracks, different stride length." "That's unusual," okay, Reeve said. "I'll need to come back in March to check the den sites for pups. That'll mean coming up the road again." He waited. "I'll knock," she said, "if that's okay." He looked at her for a moment, and then at Kodiak, who was sitting in the doorway doing the thing where he appeared to be watching the middle distance, but was actually watching everything. The dog's tail made one slow arc. Reeve looked back at Sable. "You won't need to knock," he said. "He'll hear you coming." She smiled at that. The same brief, real thing that happened on her face, and then was gone. She pulled on her pack and stepped off the porch and walked toward the plow truck with the easy stride of someone who'd been walking difficult terrain her whole life. Reeve watched until the truck turned around and started back down the road. He kept watching until the sound of the engine faded into the trees and the silence came back, which was what he'd been wanting for 3 days, and which now had a different quality than it had before. Not bad, exactly. Just different, the way the air felt different after the storm had moved through and taken its noise with it, leaving the forest in that peculiar, rearranged stillness. Kodiak pushed against his leg. Reeve put his hand on the dog's head. "I know," he said. He stood there for a while longer, listening to the quiet. Then he went inside and sat down in his chair and picked up his book, and the wood stove threw heat, and the pines held their snow, and the cabin settled around him, the way it always settled, log by log, breath by breath. And for the first time in 4 years, it didn't feel like a place he'd built to keep the world out. It felt like a place he might eventually let someone in.